Unspoken Issues.
Hey, Unspoken Decade fans. Jesse here. Recently, Chris and I created a poll on the Unspoken Decade Facebook page to see which issue we were going to be discussing on our next Unspoken Issues podcast. The choices were Spider-Man number 14 or Morbius number 12. The victory belonged to Spider-Man, and that episode is out right now if you'd like to check that out. But there happened to be a common denominator among both of those issues. It just so happened the colorist of Spider-Man 14 also wrote and colored Morbius number 12. And he sat down with Chris and I to talk about his experience with both books and a little about his career in comics as well. We hope you enjoy our interview with Gregory Wright. We have Gregory Wright right here on the Unspoken Issues podcast. Gregory, thank you very much for coming and sitting down with us and talking. Tell me first, in your own words, sir, for the Unspoken Issues fans, if you could just kind of give us an idea of what brought you into comic book creation.
You know, it's a funny story that involves not having enough money to buy a piece of pizza. So I was never a filmmaker, but I went to New York University Film School. And the great thing is when you get out of film school, it's really prepared you to get no job because your degree will not, translate. You can't just go into a movie studio and say, hey, guess what? I've got a degree in film. You may as well be a high school dropout and say the same thing because they don't care. So, you kind of go, oh, I need a job. As luck would have it, one of my roommates, who's one of my best friends, Dan Chichester, who professionally goes as DG Chichester, after he made his first student film, he could not afford to go get pizza. So he needed to get a job. So he went down to the place at school that you could get jobs and internships, and saw a very interesting paid internship that happened to be at Marvel Comics. That's how he got to Marvel Comics. Well, he did a great job there, and he wound up as an assistant editor over at Epic Comics. And they wanted him there, and he said, well, you're going to have to wait till I graduate. So once he graduated, he got a full-time position there. And I realized I needed a job. And there just happened to be an opening in the Epic department as essentially a secretary slash editorial assistant, which was certainly not what I had in mind. But I really didn't know what else to do. So I thought, well, I'll just take that job temporarily. So I went in and I got to interview with Joe Duffy, who interviewed me. And while I was interviewing, a short gentleman with a big bushy mustache came walking into the room, and I realized that it was Archie Goodwin. And I had known who Archie was from, his work on the Manhunter series that he did with Walt Simonson, as well as other stuff. And I was very starstruck because I knew who he was. This was this, incredible, famous guy coming into the room, and he opened up a bag of candy and dumped it into a jar, and immediately just, casually offered me candy, which was my introduction to Archie Goodwin. And, I stumbled through the rest of the interview, and fortunately, Joe Duffy liked me enough to offer me a job. So I took it.
Awesome.
And that's kind of how I wound up in comics. And, as you can imagine, I never really left.
No, I was going to say, you have quite the impressive resume. I was going down through some of the many books that your coloring talent has lent itself to, along with writing some books as well. I saw where you had your hand in quite a few of those, and man, I can't even go through the amount of books that I saw and keep this podcast to half an hour. So were you reading comics before, and is that kind of what led you there, or were you just like, hey, I need a job, there's the opportunity, and then you just kind of dove into the comics world?
I read comics as a kid. I read a lot of different comics. I headed towards the Marvel comics because I felt they were a little more realistic. Their characters all seemed to have actual problems, whereas, DC's characters were a little too perfect. Bruce Wayne was a really rich guy, and Superman was, perfect. But, you had characters like, Daredevil, who was blind, and yet he was a hero. And, Iron Man, who, would be dead if he didn't have his armor. I read all that stuff as a kid, and then I kind of stopped somewhere around my teenage years when I discovered that I liked, to work and make money. But then when I was in college, there was a lot of people that read, comic books, and that meant that I was reading comic books again. But of course, when you're in college, you think you know everything. So, we would pontificate about the true meaning of some of the stories in comics. So we did that. And like I just said, my pal Dan Chichester had gotten a job at Marvel. So he was bringing a lot of free comic books to us.
Oh, yeah.
Also, coincidentally, which is sort of funny, Evan Dorkin, who does Milk and Cheese, he went to NYU with us. Brian Polito, who does Evil Ernie, he was at NYU with us. And Dwayne McDuffie, who is another one of my very best friends, he was our resident advisor in the dorm at NYU.
Wow, that's crazy.
Found up in comics.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, how about favorite character?
Nick Fury. He was such a no-nonsense guy who'd done everything, but he didn't have superpowers. So he was a guy that, you could realistically imagine you could be Nick Fury. And I loved, when he was in the Howling Commandos, and then when the whole idea of S.H.I.E.L.D. was just the coolest thing, because he was the guy behind everything. There was no character he didn't know everything about. There was no character that he couldn't get the better of, mostly just, using his smarts. I mean, he was a smart guy. He was good at combat, and he had the best toys. And when you go back and you read the Steranko issues, it's just everything I ever wanted to play with. Jim Steranko seemed to be putting on that page. So yeah, and he looked cool. I don't know. There was something about this guy with an eye patch and the gray hair on the sides, smoking a cigar that everybody was a little bit leery of. I thought, oh, that's really cool. I like that guy. So
yeah, the opportunity to do Spider-Man rolls around.
I was very lucky because the editor Jim Salicrup was very, very good to me. When my very first full coloring job that I get paid for was West Coast Avengers Annual #2. After I colored that, I was Mark Grunwald's assistant editor. So I walked around to every editor and showed them what I could do, and was hoping that I could get some more work, because they'd pay you very little as an assistant editor. So getting some freelance work was something you really wanted. And Jim Salicrup took one look at everything I did, and he said, well, how would you like to color some Marvel Age pages for me? I said, well, sure, that'd be great. I'll take anything. And it was this interesting annual in which every single artist at Marvel contributed a story page to promote their book. So right away, I got to color almost every artist working at Marvel. And I tried to color each page the way the colorist that was on the book did it. So right away, I established myself as a guy who could match what the other colorists would do, which led to every editor using me when the books were late to do a couple pages here and there. So I would frequently take home about 10 pages of comic book art a night that I would have to color from 5 or 6 books and kind of match what they were doing. Because, and Jim Salicrup, who was also the Spider-Man editor, he frequently had pages of various Spider-Man books that needed a page here and a page there. So I would take those home and do it, which also included Todd McFarlane's work on the Amazing Spider-Man that he was doing originally. And Todd and I had knew each other we were supposed to do a project in my office called The Last Avengers story that Peter David wrote. We never got to do it with Todd, but Peter did it with somebody else many years later. That's one of those projects got away from me. And so Todd and I used to talk on the phone. So one day I got this phone call from Todd, and he said, which pages did you color in the latest issue of Spider-Man? And I said, why? He goes, I think I know. And I said, no, you don't. So he picked every single page that I had colored. And I said, well, how did you know? And he says, well, it looked like somebody cared.
Oh, wow.
Because typically a lot of comics were at that time, because it was very flat coloring, you just colored Spider-Man his regular colors, and then you threw in some color that the character popped off of. But I had a tendency, because of my film experience, I felt that comics should look like they were being lit by various colors of light depending on the story. So I tried to tell a story with the color. And even though I had been doing a few pages here and there that we're in the middle of an issue, if Todd did a checkerboard floor, instead of putting one color on it, I would actually make it look like a checkerboard. If Todd had a bunch of buildings in the background, instead of putting one color on all of it, I would probably color each building a different color and pick out the lights and stuff on it. Just little things And I would probably, if I would add a little bit of lighting to the figures here and there so that they popped a little more. But he really took notice, because he put a lot of work in his pages. If you are a fan of Todd, and he took notice that somebody was putting a little more effort into the pages, into certain pages, than the regular colorist was at the time. And he always wanted me to color his book. So that's kind of how I wound up on the Spider-Man title with Todd. Was he wanted me on that book, period. But the editor, Jim Salicrup, he was very loyal to his colorist that colored all the books. So he got to do that. They gave it to him, and Todd just wasn't satisfied with that. So Todd actually colored an issue himself.
Oh boy.
And to say this is what I want more, and it was very different, and that was the end of that. So they put me on the book, so I could work with Todd, because Todd and I got along very well, and I was really good at coloring Todd's stuff specifically. So that's how I wound up there. But I don't know what issue it was. It might have been like 5 or 6, maybe.
I just went through and was kind of looking through. I think it was right around that time. I think it was 5 or 6. Yeah, because I'm looking at
last story of the Torment thing, I think.
Yep, it is part 5.
I think Todd colored issue 4, and then I think I started on issue 5.
I mean, how long would it take you to color like a set issue, part 5 of Torment, or a Todd's work? How long would it take you?
Well, back then the color was way simpler.
Okay.
So, they didn't separate it on a computer. They had people who basically repainted on 9 different sheets of acetate for each shade of color. So it was very different. So you couldn't do a lot. So you had to color things more flat. It was simpler color. So, but I could color Todd's book. I mean, it kind of depended on what he drew, because sometimes, he drew a lot more than other times. But I could, because I really understood what Todd was doing, I could color one of Todd's books in a couple days. But, I would have liked to have had more time to do more with it than I was able to do. But there was only so much you could do. So
yeah, deadlines.
And sometimes you had to color it a lot faster. So you had to come up with some tricks to color fast. And some of those tricks actually are just kind of part of the style that I developed, because I like to do a lot of monochromatic stuff. And a lot of that worked. Todd liked a lot of the sort of crazy colors that I like to do. So, when we were in a pinch, we could do that. I could move very quickly. But there was a couple times where they sent me faxes of his pencils that had no black or anything, and I had to guess what the rest of the page would look like. And I colored it in and sent it in, and we kind of hoped for the best. But when it printed, you would never know that something was awry.
Yeah. When we were covering Spider-Man 14, we talked about how this was the black costume coming back. Was it exciting to be able to color the black costume Spider-Man in issue 14? Yeah,
it was fun. I mean, it especially because it was a very dark issue, down in the sewers. And I if you look at the 2 issues, once he gets to the sewers, I never color anybody their correct colors. So Spider-Man is not colored in the correct blues or anything. It's all kind of greens and just strange stuff. And I had this habit of telling editors, I'm not coloring anything the way you want, because at the time, both Marvel and DC wanted you to color the characters these very specific colors. And I said, that's really boring and dull. So I'm going to color Spider-Man this issue without using any of those colors ever. And Todd loved that. So that was the other thing, Todd loved it. So, that, and Jim Salicrup, once again, he was very supportive. He says, well, do it and let's see if it works. And fans liked what I was doing, and Todd liked what I was doing. But the black costume, it made things, very easy to make it look creepy. I don't have to worry about this red color. It's all black. But yeah, the black costume is, it's a really cool design, and it's a lot of fun. I'd like to color it now where we have all the tools to, render it properly. Because back then, you threw a couple shades of blue on it, and the artist really had to do all the work. But if you look at what Todd did on it, I mean, Todd's his black and white is very complete. It's really, really nice stuff.
Moving from 14 to 15, Eric Larson takes over, and this is right before Todd leaves. Tell me about if there was any difference when you step in and do coloring, going from one artist to the next.
Nobody ever told me what to do. Fortunately, my work kind of spoke for itself, but I always contacted whatever artist I was working with because I never wanted to do anything that they didn't like, because I figured, hey, they put all this work in. They should have a bit of a say in what I'm going to do. With Todd, Todd really liked all kinds of crazy lighting and stuff. So when I started working with Todd, I would say, okay, I can't do that unless you draw it so that I can put that on there. So if you draw it this way, I can't put a highlight there because you put a shadow there. And he very quickly figured out how to do better lighting on figures and stuff to get more interesting color. So the more he did, the more I could do. So, Todd was a very fast learner of everything. He's like, oh, okay, so if I do this, you'll do that. And I'm like, yeah. I kind of did that with everybody. And, Eric, when to get back to your actual question, when you color a different person, it's completely different. You can't color them the same. Todd was using a tremendous amount of black on his book, and Eric's work was a lot more open. Mm-hmm. So some of the stuff that I could do with Todd was not going to work on Eric. So I had to actually do a little more rendering and a little more thinking to make sure that it looked good. I kind of used the same kind of color palette that I was using with Todd so that the book didn't kind of stick out, if you know what I mean. You didn't want it to suddenly hey, surprise, this doesn't look anything like the other book. But yeah, with Eric. But Eric was, again, he's another artist that I understood his stuff. Eric and I are good friends. I always had a great time on his work. So that was actually a really fun issue to do. So when Todd left, I was thrilled that Eric was stepping in, because I just, I knew what to do with his stuff. He was always very easy to talk to about, what did this mean here? Because sometimes, the artist will draw stuff and you'll think, do they want that to be a shadow over there? Or do they want a highlight? And sometimes they'll get really angry when you mess it up. But I would just ask. I said, well, what did you mean by that? And he goes, what do you mean? I'm like, I don't know what that is. And they would tell me, and then so by letting me know, basically by working together, the final product looks closer to what they had in their head, which was nice. But nobody ever, wanted to, everybody always liked the actual colors that I used. So nobody said, hey, gosh, if you could just use more pink. That was never a conversation, that I had. I had a couple of people say, I really hate pink, so I purposely used pink to see if they would hate it when I did it. And they never noticed that I used the pink. I said, I use a lot of pink there. And he goes, oh, I didn't notice. I said, well, you don't like the way pink has been used before. So that's kind of funny.
The coloring process has changed, obviously, a lot since 1991.
Oh, yeah.
The computer coloring, I think, became a bigger deal in the early 90s.
Yeah.
I was just going to kind of see if you could give us a little taste of how much different the coloring process has changed since the early days of your career up to the late 90s up to the 2000s.
I've basically bbeen there for all of it. So when I started coloring comic books, it was the same process that they had been using for years and years, which meant what you did was you got a Xerox of the art, and then we used to have a color chart, and it was about 64 colors that you had that you could use, and you really had to put them down flat. There was no gradations or anything. Again, you generally had a day or two to do it, so you had to move quick. But you also had to put these little color codes for every single color that you used on the page. For example, when you colored Spider-Man, the blue that was on Spider-Man's costume was coded BR2, which was 100% blue and 25% red. The red of his costume was YR, 100% yellow, 100% red. And you had to code that all over for everything, every color that you did, so that also took a lot of time to do. Now, once from there, it didn't go to people sitting at a computer screen or even people who were artists. It went to a factory where basically what they did was they had three sheets of clear acetate for each shade of each color that you had. So you had 100%, 50%, and 25%. So somebody would go through the entire comic on one sheet of acetate, and they would black in all the areas that you use a 25% yellow. And then the next sheet would be all the 50% yellow. And then the next sheet would be the 100% yellow. And they would do that for the yellow, for the blue, and for the red. And then they would photograph those separately with a screen, which is where you get the dot pattern. And then they would, so there would be three different color plates that would let a certain amount of ink through to the page in those dots. So you can imagine how it was not so easy to make sure that you got proper that the comics came out right. And then you'd have a guy like Barry Windsor-Smith who would put so much crazy color all over the place. I don't know how they ever separated his stuff. Tom Palmer, the inker, he actually shared a couple secrets with me early on. Because the easier you made it for the people doing the separations, the more likely you were to get it done right. So he gave me a couple tricks that I used to make things a little easier on their part. When I did more detailed stuff, it didn't look wrong. And you've probably seen pages where you go, this looks really wrong. And because sometimes the plates would get mixed up. So the stuff that's supposed to be blue got printed as red. So you wind up with this really weird page. But what was nice, because it was on that crappy paper, was that the edges weren't really hard with the color like they are on the paper today. So if you put, like two different shades of blue together, they sort of blended together a little bit. So that was pretty cool. But, then from there, we moved to getting a fourth color, 75%. From there, we moved to being allowed to do a couple little gradations. But, when they did that, somebody got an airbrush out and they had to, basically do the airbrushing on the film. And that didn't always work out so good, but sometimes it did. And then somewhere along the line, they started getting the computer they would do it on the computer. But again, it was very, early. They could, we now had the ability to have as many colors as we wanted. They said, you don't have to code the comics anymore. And I said, this is great. So I painted it up and, would get the comic back and go, what the hell happened here? Why is my color brown? Why is this green? And I realized that they have like 7 different people working on pages on the computer. And what you see on your computer screen is not what you see in print necessarily. So they thought they were matching what I was doing, and they weren't getting anywhere close. So then I went back and started coding everything to make sure that things would come out correct. Because, brown fire is not what I had in mind. Or, when, having colorful lightning bolts that, are dull looking. And I said, no, this can't be right. Until it started moving to where we started kind of doing our own thing on the computer. So now, I can do whatever I want to do, but it takes me way longer. So I went from being able to do a book overnight if I had to it can take me like a month to properly do a book, because now I have too many choices. It was a lot easier when I had very few choices, so I knew how to do that quickly. But now I really think about the color a little too much probably. So it takes me a lot longer, and some pages take forever, depending on how much detail is in the pages and stuff. But it is nice that once you figure out you have to adjust your screen so what you see on screen is how it will look in print. And it still doesn't always work, because sometimes the paper they choose, the color is too saturated, or it gets too dark, or the colors are like weird candy colors. You have to adjust for that. But once you kind of get it, it's satisfying to be able to say, oh, this is what I had in mind, and okay, that's what the reader gets to see. Whereas before, there's lots of comics where half the detail I put in was gone. They just put a big flat blob of color in the background that I'd spent about 4 hours, detailing up so it would look cool. And that's what, the readers get to see. So that's what you get judged on, is that final color, because we also used to do a thing called blue line color. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where we would actually paint on like watercolor paper the color, and then the black line would be laid down on top of that, so that we could do a lot of interesting stuff with that. But once again, the scanners weren't so great back then. So sometimes the color that we put down was not the color that got scanned in somehow, and we couldn't really adjust it. It was a process, but some of it was good, some of it was kind of horrifying. But so yeah, things have changed a lot, but it's kind of fun to, I'm glad that I learned the old-fashioned way, because I really understand how the codes work, because the way that comics are printed, they're still printed CMYK. With percentages. So because I'm very familiar with the way the percentages should look when I'm choosing my color palettes, I do look at the percentages. And if I say, oh, there's blue in this color that I don't want in there, I can take that out. Or if there's a little bit of gray in there that, I don't want that gray in that fire, I can make sure that I get the pure colors where I really want them. And I can say, okay, maybe all the figures will never have any gray on them. And the grays will only be in the background, and that'll kind of help keep the main characters like popping off the page. So it's kind of nice like that.
Morbius number 12 was the other issue that we had in the poll that we were considering. And that was the Midnight Massacre story, which I was a huge fan of when I was a kid. You started, I guess, with issue 9 on Morbius. Len Kaminsky was the previous writer. Did you make a pitch, or were you recommended for that? How did you get that assignment?
Oh, that's a fun story. the whole Midnight Suns collection of books got started because Howard Mackey had done a great job with Ghost Rider, which I colored. Maybe that's why he did a great job. Maybe it was my color. I don't know. But, he'd done a really great job, and he had brought Johnny Blaze back into the book. And his new take on Johnny Blaze was really great. So great, in fact, that he said, geez, I'd like to do a Johnny Blaze book as well. Well, that wound up turning into Spirits of Vengeance because Marvel said, well, we don't think Johnny Blaze will sell, but, if Ghost Rider's in it as well, we can do that. So then Marvel said, hey, maybe we should have a whole line of books that are attached to Ghost Rider, which is where the whole Midnight Suns thing came in. And Len Kaminsky had actually been working on a Morbius proposal for a while. So when he heard about that, he said, ooh, here's my opportunity. So he trotted his proposal down to the editor, Bobby Chase, and they saw that and they said, hey, this is great. So, that wound up as part of the Midnight Suns. They got Ron Wagner to be the artist. Ron had drawn several issues of Ghost Rider at one point or another. So Ron and I were really good friends and really liked working with each other. Much like, with Todd, Ron and I were always talking about Morbius when I was coloring the book and Ron was drawing it. Kind of quickly, Ron had become kind of disenchanted with the stories that Len was writing. And then I found out that the editor, she was a little bit disenchanted, with Len's stories. So Ron and I kept talking about, well, what we would do if the book was just ours to do, and the next thing I know, Bobby had decided she was going to remove Len from the book. And she was sort of lamenting she wasn't quite sure who to give it to. Ron and I were in the office and I said, well, I'll write it. I'll write a couple issues for you at least. She says, really? And I said, yeah. She goes, well, write me up a proposal. So I wrote up like a 6-issue overview of what I would do if she was to give me the book. And she liked that. And then so that I had the book. But what's funny about that issue 9 was she immediately said, well, you got to rewrite this issue, which was a crossover with Doctor Strange, which Len was also writing. So now I got to call up Len and say, well, gosh, I'm sorry this happened. And, I wasn't trying to get you off the book or anything, but, and he was very cool about it. I said, now I know this is crossing over with your Doctor Strange book, so please just tell me what you need me to do. And I'll do that so that it doesn't interfere with your plans. So he graciously told me everything. And I said, okay. So I rewrote the issue and made sure all the stuff worked with that. And then I find out either Len left or he was taken off the Doctor Strange book as well. So Roy Thomas had stepped in to write the script for the previous issue of Doctor Strange that led into the issue of Morbius that I had to rewrite of Len's to coincide with the issue that Len wrote that he didn't actually wind up writing. And then Roy and Jeff Isherwood wrote the second issue of the next issue of Doctor Strange that came after the issue of Morbius the issue 9 that I wrote. So that was a very interesting way to start the book. Much to say, and I felt bad because I always liked Len.
So the Midnight Massacre was the second, I guess, Midnight Suns crossover that crossed over onto all those books.
Was it the second? Yeah, because it opened up with it opened as a crossover, and then
right.
We had that. Yeah,
I was curious, like how that was constructed. Like, were you given like an outline of this is what we need the event to do, and you were given a little wiggle room as far as what Morbius's role was going to be, or how did that work?
All of us that were writing the books got together in a conference room in some hotel place that Marvel set us up with. This was good days. Marvel had money, so they brought us in and gave us hotel rooms and stuff. And we basically spent 2 or 3 days hashing out. They basically told us, you guys have to come up with a crossover. So we sat there with Bobby Chase, the editor, and all of us. The only person that wasn't there that time was Howard Mackey, but he was there on the phone with us. So we just spent endless hours going back and forth trying to come up with something that we could all agree on that made a certain amount of sense. And a lot of really interesting ideas just kept getting rejected for various reasons. And this was what we finally all settled on. So we all kind of worked out an outline of what would happen in each book, kind of like what you suggested. Just it's a real basic outline, but we needed to know because, the whole thing basically was, Blade starts here and this is what has to happen in your issue. This is what has to happen in the next issue. all kind of co-plotted the whole basic premise. The specifics of what happened was up to us. But basically, I picked up on where the last story ended, and then I had to hand it off to, I think it was Spirits of Vengeance was the last part. I think I had the second to the last part. So yeah, we kind of figured all that. We really all figured it out. So Marvel itself didn't make us do anything. We really kind of did it ourselves. So if you really liked it, thanks. We did all that. If you hated it, I can't blame Bobby. She made sure that it all made sense. But we came up with all of the stuff to do for that all by ourselves.
I was a huge fan of the Ghost Rider and Spirits of Vengeance books, and I think I mostly just read the others during the crossover stuff because I was 12 or 13. I didn't have a lot of money to buy everything I could, but I really liked the Midnight Massacre event. It was really cool.
Well, we had those cool covers that were we had these cool black covers that looked like black envelopes.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. That was kind of, I never thought it really worked that well, but I thought it was neat, because I usually hated the gimmicky covers, but I kind of like those.
Yeah, I did too. And on the back, it had like a list of all the issues for the crossover. So it was like a checklist almost.
Yeah, it was our way of taking all the money you had in your pocket out so that we could. I didn't like that. That I got to tell you, that was the thing I didn't like. This was like where Marvel continuously was doing these things where they were kind of forcing you to buy a bunch of books that maybe you weren't all that interested in. Yeah, it's a good way of doing sales, but it's like you said, a lot of kids didn't have the money to buy all 5 issues every month, right, and buy something else. And then, of course, they kept coming out with, well, here's 6 different covers and you got to have those. And I'd be at a convention and kids would come up to me with this giant stack of, one issue that, was every, like 4 copies of every cover that they did. And I kept saying, why are you spending all your money on this? I said, go buy this many different comics. And I said, and you want me to sign these? I said, it's not going to be even valuable. And sure enough, because everybody had all of this stuff, mm-hmm, nobody made any money. And that always bothered me. I'd rather kids read a lot more books.
Sure.
Because I wanted the kids to read it. The books I wrote, I wrote them for people to read, and not to collect, so I wanted them to read them.
The 90s.
That's pretty much it. There was some good there was a lot of good stuff that came out, but sometimes it was hard to find it because there was so much material that was out, and they were constantly asking us, hey, can you create some more, more? And it's like, that's, I was writing 5 books at one time and coloring 8. I don't know how I did that, and they kept calling me to do more.
Wow.
I can't physically do it. I used to work 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. I loved every second of it. Don't get me wrong, but I don't know where I got the energy.
Yeah, I was going to say at some point, you start to wear down, I would figure, or at least you start feeling it.
When you're making comic books, there's very few jobs that are as much fun. You just imagine that, you get to write this stuff and then you get to see artwork by this great artist, mm-hmm, illustrating a story. And I got to then color it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just it really was such a high to be able to do all this stuff, and I was very lucky. I worked with, some incredible artists, like the first person that drew any story I ever wrote was Alan Davis.
Wow.
The second one was Jackson Geiss.
Mm-hmm.
Very quickly I had, Jim Lee, before he was a big deal, did a story with me. John Romita Jr. did a story with me. Will Spartasio did a story with me. And, really, I got to write a Silver Surfer story that John Buscema drew and inked. How do you say no? How do you not have a gigantic smile on your face to do that? That's probably where the energy came from, is being like, I can't believe I get to do this for a living. I still can't believe, wow, that was an amazing time. Why did that go away?
One last thing on the Morbius run. I think it went into the early 20s, maybe. I can't remember offhand, but were there any plans for the character that you didn't get to see through? I'm assuming Morbius went till about when the industry started to kind of fall off, and that's probably why it was canceled. So was there anything left undone on Morbius?
Yeah, my entire run.
Okay.
When it's really funny. When I took the book on, I had all these great ideas. Ron Wagner and I both, we had these great ideas. And the editor, Bobby Chase, she had some ideas, and this stuff was great. But almost immediately upon taking on the book, first thing I had to do was rewrite the issue that Len did. Mm-hmm. And then they needed me to do a crossover with the Night Stalkers book because they were trying to get the stuff. And I was very good at following editorial direction. I said, okay, so I put my plans on hold and did that story. And the next thing you know, we had to do the Midnight Massacre. And then I had a little bit of time to try and figure out what I wanted to do. And then we had another big crossover. And then people that were higher up than Bobby kept telling us, well, does Morbius have to actually kill people? Does he have to bite people and suck blood? Can you make him more like this? So we kept trying to find things to do based on things other people were telling us. And after about a year, I said, geez, I didn't really write any of the stories that I had intended to write in the first place. And Ron Wagner had left the book, and he was a big reason I wanted to do the book because I just loved working with him. He's just a fantastic storyteller, great artist. And I went to Bobby and I said, listen, I think the sales were waning. And I said, I just don't feel like I've written any of the stuff I wanted to write. I said, and I asked her, I said, are you happy with all the stuff? She says, well, no, this isn't what we were talking about. I said, I know. I said, I think maybe you just need to get somebody else fresh and see if you can, put the book out that you wanted to put out. So I left and the book died, I don't know, 5 or 6 issues later. But, again, it was like I think what you said, the industry started to kind of peter out and Marvel they had a bad habit of canceling titles that were still making money, but weren't home runs. So they really wanted books that were selling 200,000 copies. And they kept asking me, hey, maybe you should drop this book and, create some new book for us so we can get another #1. And I said, but I like the books that I'm working on. And I knew that if I created some new book for the #1, if it didn't sell the numbers you wanted, you'd cancel it by issue 3. Now I don't get to finish my story. Mm-hmm. So I completed all the Morbius stories that I wanted to complete. They just weren't the stories that I intended to do in the first place. Unlike when I finally got to write Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., I had a year-long storyline, and then they said, oh, we're canceling it, halfway through. And I went, uh-oh. So I had to kind of cram a lot into the very ending, and I was like, oh, this isn't enough. That was very disappointing, like I finally got to write my favorite character. And
you could see that sometimes with other books where, just like you said, something happens to where the book ends and you definitely feel like there was a lot of story that was just shoved into a few issues. Sometimes it's just the nature of the business. I'm sure you know that more than either of us. And I guess that is what it is.
Stuff happens. Sometimes there's somebody you can blame, and frequently there's not. I actually had to. There was a series called Star Masters that Mark Grunwald was writing. It was supposed to be like a 6-issue series, and they canceled it like in issue 3. So and he had no time to finish it off. But luckily, he was editing Cosmic Powers, and he said, "Hey, I'd really like to see this story get finished off. Would you mind doing it for me?" And I said, sure. Mark, again, he was my editor. I was his assistant editor. He was another one of my mentors, one of my best friends in the industry. And I said, of course, Mark, I'd be more than happy. So he gave me his outline and he says, you don't have to end it this way, but this is what I was doing. So I kind of finished that storyline off in that book so that there was a resolution to all these, characters. But it was sad that, the company did not seem to care that all these loose ends were, literally it just ended with nothing, It's like if Dallas had never come back after they shot JR. I don't know. Dallas, us old timers knew this show called Dallas.
Yes.
Some guy got shot.
I'm familiar. The focus of this episode we were doing was on Morbius, and that's mostly because there's a Morbius film coming out. They just dropped a trailer for it last week. Have you seen the trailer? Is it something that you'd be interested in, seeing a Morbius film?
Yeah, you know what? I go see all of the Marvel films, no matter what I think, because I feel like I have a stake in them. Not that anybody ever gives me any money for anything they might have used that I had anything to do with. But, it's really cool to see characters, especially characters that I worked on, suddenly they're on the screen. That's just the coolest thing. It's very frustrating that my favorite character is not on screen. They got Samuel L. Jackson version of Nick Fury, which is not my Nick Fury. So I'm very frustrated that didn't get on there. But, when I see a lot of the other characters, I love the all the Marvel TV stuff they did. That was great. I loved when Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Had a different version of Deathlock. But they did use some of our material, and I actually got a little special thanks credit in one of the episodes, which I completely geeked out over. That was cool. And I talked to the actor that played him, and he had read all of the Deathlock issues that Dwayne and I had written. So that was I don't know, that was like a geeky sort of thrill. That's so yeah, I'm looking forward to the Morbius movie. I like Jared Leto. He's a very good actor. It doesn't look like it's the Morbius I wrote or the Morbius that anybody's written. It looks very different, but that's okay. That most of the characters that they've done, they're not exactly the characters, but the essence is there. And I hope it comes out good. I mean, that would be cool to see. It'd be cool if they used anything that I did. Would be awesome.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have been talking with Greg Wright, and I can't thank you enough, sir, for coming on here to discuss Spider-Man number 14, Morbius number 12, and also your history as colorist and writer. Yeah, like I said, big get for the Unspoken Issues podcast, if you ask me.
Yeah, this was awesome. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I love the site because it brings back a lot of the good memories. It's fun to sort of make fun of that decade, but there was a lot of cool stuff that came out. That is when the Image guys did their thing. That's where I did most of my work. Whether you like it or not. But yeah, it was good. I mean, it's a great site. I tell people that, hey, you should check this out all the time. And, a lot of my contemporaries from that time, I forward stuff from that site. I said, hey, they're talking about you, go check it out. Get some love.
Oh, yeah. I noticed that you actually shared something that was involved with the Superblog team up there today, I think it was,
yes.
Where we're doing the Chromium discussion, which me and Chris, what did we do, Chris, for that? We did that. Darkhawk. Yeah, Darkhawk 25. How could I forget Darkhawk? I don't want
How dare you?
I was actually the original editor of Darkhawk.
Oh, really?
Awesome. Very cool.
Well, because I left staff before the book came out, so it went to, I'm trying to remember who did edit it. Might have been Nel Yomtov edited it, but I had a different artist. I actually had hired Keith Pollard to do the art. By the time the book came out, Mike Manley did the art, and Mike did a great job. So it's just one of those sort of funny things. So, the first few issues I say, oh, yeah, this is what Danny and I talked about. And then, he kind of went off in his own way. So, yeah, that's my little tiny contribution to Darkhawk. I was the original editor before I left staff.
Awesome.
Very cool. All right. Well, let's go ahead. We'll get into some plugs and do you got any current projects you're involved in right now, Greg?
Well, I'm working on some stuff that's not for publication yet, but I'm working on a project with Graham Nolan with Brett Blevins doing the art. Is really, really cool. It's a lot of fun. And then there's a kind of a noir horror comic that I'm going to be starting to do some color on soon that I think will be a lot of fun. The most recent thing that I did that people could go take a look at is years and years ago, Graham Nolan did this really cool comic called Monster Island, which is just a lot of fun. And he done it in black and white with the duotone shading. And he reissued it as a hardcover through a Kickstarter. I think it was a Kickstarter. And then he did a new one called Return to Monster Island, which is a lot of fun, which I had nothing to do with other than enjoying it. But he decided he wanted to have the original recolored for people to get. So I got to recolor this very old thing that he had done with the duotone shading, and that was a tremendous amount of fun. So that's available if you look up Monster Island by Graham Nolan. People can go find that, and it's both the new one and the old one they're really a lot of fun. That's kind of, for me, comics are supposed to be fun, and those are fun, and nobody's gonna cry and whine about anything in it, which is great. And then the last thing I did for DC, we did it was Graham, Chuck Dixon, and I did Bane Conquest. Which you can still find. That was a lot of fun to do that, because a lot of interesting guest stars and some characters that Chuck and Graham had introduced over the years when they had done Batman together, and so that was a lot of fun.
Very cool.
Other than I'm kind of waiting around for, now these days, because a lot of comics that I work on are more independent comics. You play the waiting game until a company says, yes, we're going to publish this, and then is there any money? And sometimes you have to do the comic for free, and then you get paid depending on the sales. So you hope people will buy it once it comes out. But that's the problem. The independent comics, they cost more. If you've ever gone on the Kickstarter, you'll find yourself going, "Oh, I'm going to buy this. This comic sounds really good. Oh, how come it costs $20 for a regular comic? That seems awfully pricey." People aren't making a lot of money to doing them, but it just, it costs. When you're not, making comics for a company that's pumping out 100,000, copies of that issue, it costs a lot more.
Oh yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So it's kind of it's weird, it's frustrating, but ultimately there's a lot of cool stuff that's out there if you find it.
The noir horror sounds right up my alley, so I'll have to keep an eye out for sure.
Yeah, I can't wait till we can sort of announce that. That sort of came my way about a year ago. I didn't know the artist, and I didn't know the writer. Another colorist artist friend of mine said, "Hey, this seems like it'd be up your alley." I couldn't do it, so they put us in touch, and I said, "Great." He didn't even know who I was, which, a lot of times people have no idea who I am, which is fun on the boards where, fans will start arguing with me about, my own work. And I'll say, "You do know that's me that did this. You do know that you're talking about people that I worked with, that I actually know the real story."
Right.
No, I read this thing. So I had to explain to this guy that I'm working with now who I am. And then he went and researched. He goes, "Oh my God, I had no idea." And I said, "That's okay. Don't worry." But it's very cool. The story is neat. And the art is really fantastic. So I hope people get to see it. But it's pretty dark, and it's dark stuff, which, I love the dark stuff, so as you could probably tell, the two books that you picked that I was working on, pretty dark.
Yes, sir. A
lot of death, I actually killed Morbius in that issue. That was fun. In the Morbius issue that I wrote, if you go to page 7, I'm actually Ron drew me as a character in there.
Oh, really?
Yeah. If you go, there's a couple guys in a lab working, talking about something, and there's a guy with long hair and a big nose, and that's me. So if you go back and you look at that issue, and that happened. Artists would frequently draw the people that they knew into issues. So, I show up all kinds of times in various issues, which is kind of funny. Not always very nice characters usually. But we always, we like to have a little fun with each other, so there's all kind of places where it's like, hey, I wonder if somebody's making fun of that guy. Yes, we were.
Wow. That's great. All right. Well, yeah, man, I'll turn you loose here. Ladies and gentlemen, again, thanks to Greg Wright for coming on here and discussing those two issues with us. Chris, where can people find you at, buddy?
At BrodyMan34 on Twitter, and you can sometimes find me on the UnspokenDecade.com. I've got a few pieces up there on their website and on Jesse's podcast from time to time as well.
That's right. The Source Material Comics podcast. If anybody's interested in checking that out, you're more than welcome to. We have our new host, which, by the way, I don't know if anybody noticed this, but our new host, W2Mnet.com, hosting the Unspoken Issues podcast and the Source Material Comics podcast. But if you'd like to follow me, you can do so at Stiznarkey on the Twitter, Stiznarkey. Thanks again, Greg Wright, for coming on here. For Chris Armstrong, I am Jesse Starcher. Have a good one. Bye-bye.